Hi, I'm Kim Walker, Director of the School of Music, and today I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you for the MusicHub event. Each week we're sharing new stories from the faculty and the students, all about what inspired them about music and brought them here to Texas Tech University in the very first place. I hope you'll enjoy these inspired stories at least half as much as I do. Thank you and enjoy.
Hello, and welcome to the Music Hub of the Texas Tech University School of Music. My name is Charles Olivier, and I am your host for this episode of a Music Hub Moment. On today's show, we will be listening to an interview done by Dr. Stacy Jacoy, Associate Professor of Musicology, with Dr. Keith Howard, Visiting Professor of Ethnomusicology here at the Texas Tech School of Music. Dr. Howard's research focus is the music of the Korean Peninsula, which he has published several books over, including his newest book, Songs for Great Leaders. Now let's listen as Dr. Jacoy interviews Dr. Howard on what ethnomusicology is and his work on the music of the Korean Peninsula.
Here we are today, and I know that Charles Olivier has just said that we are talking today with Professor Keith Howard from SOAS in London. And so just to get us started, I know that you are a visiting professor here at Texas Tech in the School of Music, but what do you do at your home institution?
Well, I did teach an awful lot of courses and various types of courses, all the way from music business through to music and healing, with elements of shamanism and other religions taken in there, plus general ethnomusicology, the history and theory and methodology in ethnomusicology, and also courses on East Asia, traditional music, pop music, including, of course, Korea, Siberian, and various other topics from Kyrgyzstan down to Zimbabwean music. Well,
lovely. That's a broad swath. So we were really excited to have you here when you, for this last semester, and hopefully again sometime in the future. So for our audience who may not know, could you give us sort of a broad description? What would you say is an ethnomusicologist?
That's a good question, and I'm probably going to be quite provocative in answering it. You see, to me, and I grew up playing the piano, my BA is in Western classical music, my MA is in composition, particularly electronic composition. To me, the term musicology has basically been hijacked by those who study and perform Western classical music, art music. Whereas in fact, musicology is the music in the world and the study of that music. That's what ethnomusicology became, but particularly in the 1950s onwards, looking at music from places other than the West. That's the ethno bit. But the ethno is a very sort of unfashionable thing to have there, and ethnomusicology probably wants to get rid of it. But ethnomusicology looks at music. Mm-hmm. And by default, it's looked at music in culture, the social cultural context of music making, history and things like that, across the world. But if you do it across the world, you can also do it back in Europe and America, at which point I suppose it becomes something like looking at why Mozart composed the way he did, looking at the social and cultural context of his time and seeing what happened there. It looks at the development of instruments or something like that. So to be fair, musicology these days has broadened out. So musicology in some places will look at pop music, it will look at, say, music psychology or music and healing, still typically from a Western viewpoint, whereas ethnomusicology would say we look at music in the world and we bring in ideas from the world. You could also look at it as a way of, after World War II, when the United Nations was formed, essentially we were interested in the way other people thought and other people talked about things. And there's literature from the 40s, 50s, 60s about this. Ethnomusicology fits in there very well. Why should we, from Europe and America, look at music in, for argument's sake, Korea, from our perspective, without going and talking to these people, without going and exploring it? And ethnomusicology does exactly that. It explores music from wherever it is, and it creates ethnographies and writing about music to explain that music to a different audience.
Right. No, definitely. I talk quite a bit in my classes and musicology classes about the different way that we try to approach, whether it's from a more traditional Western direction or one that seeks to really go out and investigate those different places. And so, as you say, the two really are merging in many ways. So what drove you then to become an ethnomusicologist? How did you, and then from there, how did you come to focus on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, first of all, I started out with Western art music and composition, and also teaching in schools, which is what many university music graduates go on to do. I was very unhappy with school music teaching, but I was unhappy because essentially most students don't like their music lessons in schools. But they leave the class and they turn on their, these days, whatever it is. In the old days, it was Walkmans. Yep. Now it may just be the internet connection wherever they've got it. But they want music, but they don't want the music lesson. And that struck me as very strange. Now, in composing, there was something very similar going on, that to get commissions, I could write in a very academic way, and I'd get a profile as an academic composer. But actually, the audience for that music was tiny. And it, you'd spend maybe 200-300 hours writing a piece. It would be performed once to an audience of 30-40 people, and that would be it. Maybe I wasn't a very good composer, but the point is that somehow it struck me that we in the West have lost touch with music as part of our life, music making as part of our life, and we've sort of separated it out. Music has become something that's created for us and we consume it. Or a few of us may perform it, but only a few of us, the rest no. And there's something, to me, very wrong with that. So I moved to ethnomusicology essentially to answer those questions. How could music function in a contemporary society? Now, if I looked at it in my own culture, I'd be very subjective. I had my own opinions about Western art music, Western popular music, all the music I was familiar with. So I wanted to go somewhere else. And being a sensible type of person, I thought, well, if I do a PhD, I may not actually get a job in academia afterwards. So I better choose somewhere where I could potentially get a job in industry or the stock market or something. So I ended up looking at East Asia. And I looked at Japan and found far too many foreign scholars there. I looked at China, and this is sort of 1980-ish. So China was just coming out of the Cultural Revolution. I'd have been stuck in a conservatoire. What's the problem there? Well, I'd learned Chinese music, but I couldn't really talk to people. I couldn't find out how people were using music. And then I turned to Korea. I heard some Korean music and thought, wow. And it was percussion music. I had my first taste of Korean food and thought, okay, possibly interesting. And I looked at the country and noticed that essentially there were very, very few people looking at anything to do with Korea. It was sort of an open place to go and study, but very few Westerners had been there. And yet its music was fascinating. And the country, this is South Korea, was going through a modernization process. It's now a very modern country. In the 60s and 70s, it wasn't. So in the 80s, that gave me the opportunity to see things as they were and as they were becoming. So the old styles of music, folk music would be a common way to describe those, but traditional music, and popular and classical music. So I could see the whole thing going on there. And I thought that would be an ideal place to go to. So I did.
Right. So over the time then, so from, I guess, the 80s to now, what would you say are some of the most interesting societal changes that you've noticed in Korea since, the beginning of your work to now?
Well, essentially, Korea has emerged onto the world stage, and it's done so in the last 35 years. Many people would say the Seoul Olympics in 1988, with its slogan, Soul to the World, World to Soul, that was when we really got to know about a contemporary Korea. Until then, we had the image of MASH, the Korean War, poverty, that sort of thing. Now, when I first went to Korea, it was still coming out of the poverty thing. There were still unmade roads. There were still people who were immensely poor. There were still slums. By, I suppose, 2000, it had moved into one of the top economies in the world. And South Korea is normally ranked 10th, 11th, 12th economy in the world today. So it's very, very modern, very contemporary, and it's on a par with many other cultures. So I've seen that transition. In terms of the music industry, I've seen a massive transition in things like pop music. So I go back, the first edition of the Rough Guide to World Music had a piece on pop music, and it said there is nothing in Korea that's of interest. There's nothing to match what you find in Japanese or Indonesian pop music.
Right.
It was out of date then, but you couldn't say that now. There's been a massive change there. In terms of Koreans on the international stage in music, there's been a massive change there. A huge number of Koreans have emerged to take sort of piano competitions, violin competitions, other competitions around the world. They're very much leading in terms of Western art music. In fact, the conductor of the Lubbock Symphony Orchestra is Korean. And so it goes on like that. So we've seen all of those changes.
Right. So that probably answers part of the next question then, but there's probably more as well. What thoughts and questions then drive you back to study more of Korean culture in particular?
Yeah, there's hidden within there's an issue about ethnomusicology, which is we get sort of typecast and we get caught going back to the culture in which we did our PhD, basically. And it's very difficult to get away from it. If you were a Western musicologist, it probably wouldn't matter if you were a Bach scholar, looking for the rest of your career at basically one composer and his music, or a Beethoven scholar. And yet, it seems rather narrow to go back to one country, Korea. Many ethnomusicologists do that sort of thing. They get caught in a culture. If I apply for grants and the word Korea is not there, then probably the people looking at those grant applications question it. And that's happened to me, for instance, recently with a grant on reggae and a research application.
Right.
So this was to do with reggae in London and how that was very, very important to the development of reggae. But it's basically undocumented because reggae is supposed to be Jamaican. Well, obviously Jamaica and Britain have a lot of connections. But one of the reviews came back and said, what is this person who does Korea doing looking at reggae? The same happens when I work on other places. I have a book on the Kyrgyz Manas, Kyrgyzstan. I have videos, DVDs on Siberia. I have work on Thailand. I have work on Zimbabwe. So I have moved around, but I do keep going back to Korea, South Korea and North Korea. Not because it's easy, but because I need to keep going back. This is when the anthropologist side comes in. If I talk to you about the way music was 30, 40 years ago, you're not really interested. You want to know today. If I talk to the media about what's going on today, they want to know that I've been there recently, that I've observed what's going on recently. So I do like going back to Korea at least once a year, perhaps twice a year, just to keep up to speed, just to observe it and breathe it in, take it in, just so that I feel that I have some sort of competence in talking about what Korea is today. Another aspect, though, is that when I started my studies on Korean music, I thought many Koreans would take over. Many of them would come to Europe and America, do their PhDs, and there'd be nothing left for me to do, because if you're a native Korean speaker, you can look much more quickly, much more deeply than I can into the literature, into getting your resources together. It's not easy to have to deal with different languages. It's not easy to have to source historical texts, to have a keyboard on your computer that does 2 languages, which mine does.
Right.
None of this is easy. So I assumed Koreans would come along. In some ways they have, but they've never really covered the things that I'm interested in. So I'm still finding things to do. My most recent book, which you're going to ask me about in a minute, on North Korean music and dance. There is no other book on North Korean music and dance in English, or there wasn't until extremely recently. The other one that's come out, I edited for a set of Korean authors. So there's my monograph, but then an edited book. That's quite amazing that nobody has wanted to or decided to study in great depth a country and its music.
Certainly. No, certainly true. So I guess as a way to pull together some of these disparate threads, then what do you think your years of study, how have they impacted the way that you look at the world? I mean, you've answered some of that already, but.
It's given me a breadth of knowledge and stopped me being too subjective, unless I want to be, on my own upbringing and my own culture. I can come back and, there are things in my upbringing and culture that I really treasure, don't get me wrong. But I want to be able to step outside them as well and look in and be a little bit more critical. And so ethnomusicology has allowed me to do that. Looking from Korea, I've been very involved with the discourse on, say, intangible cultural heritage and how we should sustain and preserve the traditions, the musical traditions, but other traditions as well that have come down to us. And I've learned that from Korea. I've learned a lot about composition, and in particular, how composers can take on board elements of a musical tradition, their own tradition or another tradition, and use those as well as Western art traditions or Western pop traditions. I've found out many things about religious experience and healing through Korea, both at one end, it's more charismatic Christian communities, where music is a very strong feature. On the other side, traditional shamanism and the sort of persistence of this pre-modern religious ritual tradition. And that I can apply to other music cultures. So when I've moved to, say, Siberia, I'm immediately sort of joining the dots, partly from what I know in Korea, but then asking the Siberians. And the attraction of Siberia was because the Korean population migrated from somewhere there 2,000, 2,500 years ago, or many of them did. I was interested in intangible cultural heritage in Siberia, how Olonho, the epic storytelling up in Yakutia, has been nominated first as a UNESCO masterpiece. How the music of the Samiski, the Orthodox Christian groups who were moved there in the 17th, 18th century and basically deposited there with their traditions from the west of Russia and the Ukraine. Again, their singing style, which some people would call authentic singing, is part of the intangible cultural heritage. And again, it's been nominated by UNESCO. In Kyrgyzstan, the epic storytelling there, the Manas, is what I've been looking at. Again, working with musicians, but there are connections with sort of epic storytelling through to Korea. So I apply some of what I've learned from Korea when I go to other places. It doesn't mean I compare them, but I apply what I've learned.
Right. One of your most recent books, as you just mentioned, has started to garner quite a bit of attention with the media, CNN, and several other journals you've told me about, or newspapers as well. So the music for Great Leaders, yes, is the title?
Songs for Great Leaders.
Oh, sorry, Songs for Great Leaders. I apologize. And so of the music and dance of North Korea. So could you tell us just a little bit more about it, please?
Yeah, so this book is the result of a very long journey, which started, I suppose, back in 1992 when I first went to North Korea. And I went partly, I was persuaded by a Korean composer, that the most well-known of Korea's 20th century composers, Lee Sang-yoon. He, by then, had an institute in Pyongyang, It's a long story, but he never went back to South Korea, although he'd been born there. And he was able to help get me a visa because I felt, I've been working on Korea, but actually I've only been working on South Korea, which is only half of the Korean peninsula. So I felt I needed to go to the north. So I went, I conducted some interviews, I did a lot of recording. I had actually tremendous access compared to most scholars who go there. So that was the start. And very quickly after I came back, people were interested. I did a BBC radio program that I wrote and did everything apart from direct. I put together all sorts of interview materials, some writing. And over the years, I managed a few small articles. I went back in 2000. I've been in touch with North Korean refugees in a number of places. I've been in touch with North Koreans who visit Europe or America. I've been in touch with some North Koreans in South Korea. And Britain at that point, it's probably worth saying, is home to the second largest community of North Korean refugees. The first largest is in South Korea. So we have a lot of North Koreans here, sort of living below the radar, so they're not easy to meet and work with. But I was fascinated by this curious country, which we're always told we know nothing about. And as I researched the book, clearly the interviews and the materials I obtained in North Korea had to be expanded upon. Tremendous library resources in parts of America, up in the Harvard Yenching, in Columbia University Library, in Princeton, in a number of other places. In East Asia, in China, the border regions between Korea and China are home to lots of Chinese Koreans and a university. Across in the Soviet Union, in Kazakhstan, in Uzbekistan, and obviously in South Korea and across in Japan, there are ultimately huge amounts of materials to be looked at and explored, most of which you can't find in North Korea. So I was able to piece together the account basically by finding the archived materials, some in dusty cellars that librarians hadn't been to for a couple of decades, others in boxes that hadn't yet been opened, where somebody had died and an archive had just become available, this sort of thing.
Right.
So it's been quite a journey.
Definitely. So when people think about Korea today, of course, especially even just in the last year or 2 years, they think about K-pop. That's just become the main thing that connects K-pop, Kdrama, of course. But how does that affect North Korea?
A good question, and it's very difficult to answer. Clearly, for the last 20 years, some South Korean popular culture has been getting into North Korea, whether it was on CDs and DVDs, videos, etc., these days on thumb drives, arguably hidden away on karaoke machines. And because of that, we are aware that a number of the North Korean refugees who've come out of North Korea have heard and have participated in singing sessions of, say, South Korean K-pop while they've been in North Korea. It's also very clear that in the last 20 years, a number of sort of almost underground clubs have opened up. Sometimes they've been closed down as well. So there's been a demand for popular culture which wasn't really being met by the regime with its sort of authorized take on pop. And so K-pop has been getting in. The border with China is always going to be the main way that things get in, but there are other ways as well. So it's had a certain amount of impact to the extent that certainly under the current leader, Kim Jong-un, the authorized pop has sort of been recalibrated in ways that go towards the sort of slightly more sexy image of South Korean girl idols.
Right, which was part of my next question.
Okay, we'll come back to that then. But it's sort of been recalibrated with a number of groups, but not totally, because essentially North Korea is still caught with its sort of ideological authoritative positions, with censorship, with legislation and things. It's very difficult to bring in something that gets rid of the way things have been in the past. And so even with it, the probably the best known of the more recent groups is Moranbong. Moranbong is Moran Hill. It's the hill where Kim Il-sung gave his first speech in September 1945 when he returned to North Korea in Soviet uniform, but don't tell North Koreans that. Now, Moranbong as a group, girl group, they sort of modeled themselves partly on the Chinese 12-girl band, but they were playing skeleton violins and things. They were instrumentalists initially. Very, very pretty, carefully chosen, with the backing band normally behind a screen so that it didn't distract from anything. But they were always playing songs, even though they were instrumental versions. And those songs were the old songs because they had the right ideology in them. Then at one point in 2015, Moranbong disappeared. And when they came back, they were very chastened, less makeup, less of the short skirts, and often with singers, so that the lyrics are there and the ideology is very sort of foregrounded. So not a lot has changed, basically.
So they got sexy and they got sort of almost Western, and then they got pulled back and sort of.
It was never the sort of sexualization that you get in K-pop.
Right. Okay.
But it was more than you would have had, say, 50, 60 years ago.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, so I know because, of course, we had the pleasure of having the class with you this semester, and you were here with us in Texas for just a couple of weeks before spring break and before things basically locked down, as we know, for COVID-19. But I know that you have a lot of stories of your work in Korea, particularly in North Korea, probably several that you wouldn't be able to share with us, but would there be any that you might be able to share with us about working in North Korea, how it's so different perhaps from other parts of the world and South Korea as well?
Well, there's plenty that I can say. Obviously, I think the problem with North Korea is if you've talked to someone and the person has a name, then if you say something which is critical, and that person then is in danger or will suffer from the regime, then it's not fair to them. So I do have to be careful at that point. I also have to be careful because North Korea doesn't like foreigners being critical. However, to give a proper, full account of music and dance in North Korea requires one to go against much of the standard dogma that is there in the authorized history and the authorized view of just music or anything else. So I have been critical where I've needed to be. The sort of stories in North Korea, there are far too many, but I think one of the most wonderful things is that I've been able to interview people and talk deeply. I've been able to spend days with, say, a North Korean fiddle player or a North Korean shawm player, and spend days going over an instrument and its repertoire and what that person has actually composed for it. With the shawm, when I got a shawm from the North Korean factory, it didn't work. And the senior instrumentalist who was showing me this instrument said, well, what do you expect? Because they're not really musicians at a factory. You could say that was critical. But okay, he took it away and he spent the weekend to make it work, and then he showed me all sorts of things on it. Tremendous patience, because my Korean is not particularly good, and a tremendous amount of detail that I was able to get. So I do thank those people, and the North Koreans have brains. They're as intelligent as anyone else in the world. So when you meet a scholar or a musician, you should treat them like that. They may have to say things in particular ways to keep in an appropriate position with the regime, but yes, they're intelligent beings. So I think that's the first thing. The sort of stories, I've just told you one there, the ability or the having the chance to spend days with musicians working on their music, their traditions and things, being taken to the dance college and spending a day working on dance notation. North Korea has a particular type of dance notation which it claims overcomes the difficulties of, say, Laban notation or Benesh or any of the other notations that we've used in the West.
And is that part of how they make those enormous dance extravaganzas? Is that...
Indeed, yes. And my book deals with some of this, and it shows some of what's going on there. It's a system that's based on partly the alphabet, partly pictorial things, and partly symbols that signal accents or whatever. But it was fascinating to spend a day just learning with the professors this notation, just a little bit about it. And then at one point, the professors invited in some of his students, and there was a computer to type this notation, and he typed something out, and the students were immediately able to dance it. Wonderful.
Wow. Yeah.
There's great things like that. Some of the performances, of course, were great. I haven't been to the Arirang Festival, 100,000 people performing in front of you.
Right.
I've watched many videos. Other stories, I went down to the DMZ. I've been to the DMZ on both sides, and it's much more frightening looking from the north to the south than it is from the south to the north.
Well, I know that this, it hooks up a little bit. I mean, just kind of thinking about leadership in North Korea. I mean, Kim Jong-un right now has been conspicuously missing from the media. Is there a reason for that you might be willing to guess at?
I wouldn't want to guess. I think the rumours, as we speak, the rumours have blown up again today, and there's plenty on the media. The challenge is that essentially South Korea and the South Korean government, which is normally pretty well keyed into things, is saying there's nothing to worry about here. Now, why are they saying that? Well, essentially because there are three things we can observe, even if you haven't got ears on the ground. One is the border region, where there are something like 200,000 troops facing each other from north and south. There have been, as far as the South Koreans are concerned, there's been absolutely no signal of anything happening there. Now, if there was a problem in North Korea, you would expect the troops to be on guard and very, very vigilant to stop anything happening in terms of an invasion from South Korea, ultimately. But nothing's happening there. Second thing, around Pyongyang, there are something like 25,000 specialist troops who guard Pyongyang. You're not allowed into Pyongyang, the capital city, unless you have the right credentials. You're a good party member, you have the passes and everything. So I've been stopped even going in with guides from the airport there because we took the wrong road. So it's very rigid. There is absolutely no sign that anyone is tightening up on security in Pyongyang. The third thing which South Korea would be able to pick up on is any sort of radio phone calls and things, anything going across web lines.
Right.
And clearly it hasn't. So all those three would normally be expected if there was a problem with the leadership.
Right.
And the normal thing, North Korea has been there for 75 years. It's been behaving the same way for 75 years. So there's a fair amount of both understanding and appreciation of what would mark a change. So there's that side. That's not to say that nothing has happened, but we just don't know the significance of what's going on. Right. Everything else is rumours at the moment. I think the most prescient thing is that Kim Jong-un did not turn up for Kim Il-sung, the founder and the first leader, for his celebration, his birthday celebration. Right. Now, Kim Jong-un rests his authority on being the grandson of Kim Il-sung. His facial features, the way he dresses, are all meant to tell us that he's in the line of Kim Il-sung.
Too, yeah.
Yeah. So for him not to turn up was quite remarkable. At the same time, this happened at the same sort of time as Kim Jong-un's sister was being promoted and brought back in after a few months away because of the Hanoi summit with Trump, into central circles. And so questions would be asked about her role and whether she's being groomed to be a successor. So the questions are there, but there is no evidence that anything is wrong.
Right. So just curious, I mean, I know it's as you say, it's been blowing up in the media all over the place. So, well, getting back to K-pop, just to round out our talk here, and again, we're just so happy and so thankful that you brought your deep knowledge of Korea and K-pop to Texas Tech, and of course the surrounding Asian popular musics as well, which was part of the title of the class. And these classes, as I'm sure you've noticed, are popping up all over the place now. I noticed when we were getting ready to do this one that just the semester before, there had been at least about a dozen all over the United States, and a few more in the few semesters before that. So as K-pop now and the surrounding Asian pops are becoming part of an area of study, all over the globe, really. I mean, what do you think about courses like this and sort of the changing face of global pop education?
Yeah, I think, I come from Britain, and in Britain, music departments, a lot of music departments have moved into popular music, and they sort of separate out what we would call a BMUS, the more serious side of musicology, the more analysis, theory, all of the technical side, from the more popular classes as a sort of BA, so Bachelor of Arts. That's been very successful for a number of places. And clearly the popular music industry is where there are jobs for many people, probably far more than there are in classical music, art music. So I think as a music department, it's quite important to have the two things. But that's very much a British perspective, and I recognise that. In terms of East Asian pop and K-pop, when I was growing up, I was really growing up in a monocultural society. Everything was white. When there was black culture, it was thought of as strange, and it's from somewhere else. It was a very monocultural environment. If you looked at sort of the EMI catalogue or any other catalogue of a record studio, it was very white. When black music started coming in, it was sort of something that we might listen to, but we kept it at a slight distance. I guess the two came together with things like lovers rock and punk. So fair enough. But if you think about that, you listen to your radios now, you listen to, or you watch television and you see adverts, and we're used to hearing music from Africa, the Caribbean, bits of Asia, all over the place. And we don't think of it as something particularly strange. We used to. And so with popular music, why not? Why do we just need to have popular music from our own culture? K-pop is clearly on the ascendant, and it is massive. Gangnam Style has notched up more than 3 billion views on YouTube. That's not bad going, really. And the K-pop industry is particularly large, and if you go into one of the few remaining record stores around, you'll probably find plenty of K-pop. You certainly will here in Britain. So it's out there, and it's really very successful. I think we need to deal with it. The inverse of that is probably that in terms of Asian studies, certainly, in our universities, Asian studies has typically been language, culture, and history. Language, literature, and history, maybe, more than anything else. And the sort of popular side of things is something that has often been pushed to one side and thought of as not really appropriate. There's an old thing there about popular culture being something that's just sort of synthetic, it's industrial production, it's not really high art.
Right.
Now, what happens when your students are coming to your university because they've got into the pop music of the place they want to study, or the films, or something else, but popular culture? That's what we're seeing. It actually started with Southeast Asians in Europe and America, as well as Southeast Asia, in universities, wanting to take Korean language classes around 2000, 2001. And I've got a copy of email exchanges at the time, because a lot of professors, in this case Korean studies, were saying, what's going on? And it was because the students were into popular culture.
Right.
It's now happening in terms of K-pop. It's reckoned that in the last 3 years, Korean studies programs in the States have doubled their student enrollments.
Yeah.
The same in Europe.
Yeah, we have a new Korean program here at Texas Tech, and they're also offering this summer a Kdrama class for the first time as well.
So it's incumbent on us as academics to work with popular culture, because our students expect us to.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. So great. Well,
sort of, just to finish that off, that sort of says something else about my academic career, where I've managed a number of times to produce the first book of. And one was the edited book I put out on Korean pop music, which came out in 2006.
Right.
It's before anything else you'll find in English. There's plenty out there now, and that book looks pretty sort of old-fashioned, of course. I did the same with a lot of the work on say, comfort women, more anthropological work, the women forced into sexual slavery. So I suppose the North Korean book follows in that sort of line.
Right.
So I would like to push the boundaries. And essentially what I'm doing with the book on North Korean music and dance is saying the same to Korean studies. But Korean studies is more than just what we can get from South Korea. And it needs to.
Of course. Oh, I completely agree. I think, clearly, if we're going to study Korea, we need to bring in both sides of the equation and try as much as we can, especially given the difficulties of doing so, to understand how the two work together. So, great. Well, again, thank you. I wish we could talk about more of the books. I know you have another one coming out as well, just in another few months, actually. And so I'd love to talk about more of those, but I know we've already gone fairly over. So thank you again so very much for taking the time to talk with us today and give us more about your work and about K-pop and North Korea and just all of it.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the interview done by Dr. Jacoy with Dr. Howard just as much as I did. We look forward to seeing you next Tuesday with another episode of a Music Hub Moment brought to you by the Texas Tech University School of Music. Thank you and have a great week. Hello, and welcome to the Music Hub of the Texas